What happens when Hollywood's most legendary actor meets daytime television's most controversial hosts? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down with the View panel, only to find himself in the crosshairs of what can only be described as an ambush. The tension that erupted during last night's taping has sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry, and by the end of this explosive encounter, one of cinema's greatest icons would storm off the set in a display of righteous fury that left the studio audience stunned into silence. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when professional respect collides with daytime drama politics. The stage was set for what should have been a routine promotional appearance. Harrison Ford, the 81-year-old acting legend, had agreed to appear on The View to discuss his latest project and reflect on his storied career spanning over 5 decades. The producers had promised a light-hearted conversation about his upcoming film and perhaps some nostalgic stories from the Indiana Jones and Star Wars franchises that made him a household name. What they delivered instead was a masterclass in how to disrespect a guest who has given audiences more iconic moments than perhaps any other actor of his generation. From the moment Ford walked onto the set, something felt different. The usual warm welcome that guests receive was notably absent. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting in her moderator's chair, barely looked up from her notes as Ford made his entrance. The audience applauded enthusiastically, clearly excited to see the legendary actor, but the energy from the panel felt cold, almost dismissive. Ford, ever the professional, smiled and waved to the audience before taking his seat, seemingly unaware of the hostile environment he was about to enter. "So, Harrison," Whoopi began, her tone already carrying an edge that regular viewers would recognize as her signature setup for controversy. "You've been making movies for what, 50 years now? Must be nice to have that kind of job security in Hollywood, especially for someone who's never really had to worry about the kinds of issues that affect regular working people." The comment landed like a lead balloon. Ford's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but those who know him well could see the slight tightening around his eyes. Here was a man who had worked his way up from being a carpenter to becoming one of the most respected actors in the industry, being lectured about privilege by someone who seemed to have no understanding of his journey. "Well, Whoopi," Ford replied, his voice maintaining its characteristic measured tone, "I think you might be surprised to learn that I spent years working construction, doing carpentry, struggling to make ends meet while trying to break into this business. Nobody handed me anything." But Whoopi wasn't done. She leaned forward in her chair, her body language becoming more aggressive. "Oh, come on, Harrison. Let's be real here. You're a white man in Hollywood. You think that didn't open doors for you that weren't available to others? You think your path was the same as someone who looked like me trying to make it in this industry?" The other panel members exchanged glances, clearly sensing that this was going in a direction that had nothing to do with promoting Ford's new project. Joy Behar shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Sunny Hostin looked like she was preparing to jump into the fray. The audience, meanwhile, had gone from excited to confused to increasingly uncomfortable as they watched their beloved Indiana Jones being put on trial for crimes he had never committed. Ford's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not going to minimize anyone else's struggles, but I'm also not going to apologize for working hard and being fortunate enough to find success in a field I'm passionate about. I've always believed that talent and persistence matter more than anything else." "Talent and persistence," Whoopi repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's a nice way to put it. Must be easy to believe that when the system was designed to benefit people who look exactly like you." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Ford's publicist, sitting in the green room watching the monitor, was already reaching for her phone, no doubt preparing to cut this disaster short. But Ford himself wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed to be gathering himself for what was about to become a legendary moment of pushback against the kind of woke hectoring that has become all too common in media interviews. "You know what, Whoopi," Ford said, his voice still controlled, but with an undercurrent of steel that anyone who had seen him in his most intense film roles would recognize. "I came here to talk about my work, to connect with fans, and to have what I hoped would be a respectful conversation. If you want to have a political discussion, that's fine, But don't pretend to know my story or lecture me about my journey when you clearly haven't done your homework. The audience was now completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Whoopi's eyes flashed with anger at being challenged so directly. She was used to guests either agreeing with her perspectives or meekly accepting her criticisms. Ford's pushback was clearly not what she had expected, and her reaction would prove to be the catalyst for what was about to become an even more explosive confrontation. "Excuse me." Whoopi shot back, her voice rising in both volume and indignation. "Don't lecture me about homework, Harrison. I've been fighting battles in this industry since before you were Han Solo. I know exactly what privilege looks like, and I'm looking right at it." Joy Behar, perhaps sensing that things were spiraling out of control, attempted to interject with a weak attempt at humor. "Well, I think we can all agree that Harrison has given us some great movies over the years." But Ford was no longer in the mood for diplomatic pleasantries. The disrespect had gone too far, and anyone who knew anything about his reputation in Hollywood knew that he had never been one to suffer fools gladly. The man who had famously told directors exactly what he thought of their scripts, who had never been afraid to speak his mind even when it might cost him roles, was about to remind everyone why he had earned the respect of his peers through decades of professionalism and integrity. The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, and what happened next would transform this from an uncomfortable interview into a viral moment that would be discussed and analyzed for weeks to come. Ford's patience was wearing thin, and Whoopi's aggressive approach was about to meet its match in someone who had no intention of being bullied on national television. "Let me tell you something," Ford said, his voice dropping to that familiar, gravelly tone that had commanded respect in boardrooms and movie sets for decades. "I've sat through a lot of interviews in my career, good ones and bad ones, but I've never had someone invite me onto their show just to attack me personally for things I had nothing to do with." Whoopi's face flushed with anger. She clearly wasn't used to being called out so directly, especially not by someone who was supposed to be there as her guest. "Attack you? Oh, please. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about reality. Maybe that's something you're not used to in your Hollywood bubble." "My Hollywood bubble?" Ford's eyebrows raised, and those watching could see the same intensity that had made his portrayal of characters like Jack Ryan so compelling. "You mean the bubble where I spent my 20s hammering nails and building cabinets because I couldn't afford rent? Where I got my first break because a director happened to need someone to build bookcases in his office? That bubble." Sunny Hostin, who had been sitting quietly, decided this was her moment to pile on. "But Harrison, you have to acknowledge that once you got that break, your race and gender made your path easier than it would have been for others." Ford turned to face her, his expression incredulous. "You know what I have to acknowledge? Nothing. I don't have to acknowledge anything to you or anyone else. I worked for what I achieved. I showed up, I did the work, I treated people with respect, and I earned my place in this industry." The audience was completely captivated now, watching this Hollywood legend defend himself against what was clearly becoming a coordinated attack. Some audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others were leaning forward, unable to look away from the train wreck unfolding before them. Whoopi wasn't backing down. If anything, Ford's resistance seemed to fuel her aggression. "Earned your place? Really? You think it's just coincidence that almost every major action hero of your generation happened to be a white guy? You think that was just merit?" "I think," Ford said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his years and experience, "that you're trying to diminish my life's work to make some kind of political point, and frankly, I find it insulting. Not just to me, but to every person of any background who has worked hard to achieve something." Joy Behar, sensing the interview was completely off the rails, made another attempt to redirect. "Well, let's talk about your new movie." "No," Whoopi interrupted sharply, clearly not done with her interrogation. "I want to finish this conversation. Harrison, do you or do you not believe that systemic advantages played a role in your career?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ford stared at her for a long moment, and viewers could practically see him making a decision about how far he was willing to let this go. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow more powerful. "You want to know what I believe? I believe that I'm sitting here being lectured by someone who clearly invited me on this show under false pretenses. I was told we'd be discussing my new film and my career. Instead, I'm being put on trial for the crime of being successful while white. And you know what the most insulting part is? You're doing it while cameras are rolling, knowing that anything I say will be taken out of context and used against me. The studio was dead silent now. Even the crew members had stopped what they were doing to watch this unprecedented moment unfold. Ford's publicist was frantically gesturing from the sidelines, but he seemed completely focused on the confrontation at hand. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, a smirk playing across her face. So you're saying you're the victim here? I'm saying, Ford replied, his voice steady but his eyes flashing with anger, that I'm a guest on your show being treated with complete disrespect. And I'm wondering why you thought that was acceptable. Sarah Haynes, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. Harrison, I think what we're trying to understand is your perspective on diversity in Hollywood. Ford turned to her with an expression that could have melted steel. My perspective? My perspective is that I've worked with actors and directors and writers of every background you can imagine. I've seen talent triumph regardless of where it came from. What I haven't seen is much value in sitting around categorizing people by their demographics and then telling them what they should or shouldn't have achieved based on those categories. Whoopi was growing visibly more agitated. That's easy to say when you're at the top of the mountain looking down. The top of the mountain. Ford's voice was rising now, his legendary composure finally beginning to crack. Lady, I started at the bottom of a construction site. I earned every single thing I got through work, through showing up, through being professional, and through never, ever treating people the way you're treating me right now. The tension in the studio was now so thick, it was almost suffocating. Audience members were looking at each other with expressions of shock and disbelief. This wasn't the friendly celebrity chat they had come to see. This was a full-scale confrontation between a respected Hollywood icon and a daytime television host who seemed determined to destroy him on live television. That Whoopi's mask was completely off now. Don't you dare lecture me about professionalism. I've been a professional longer than you've been famous. Ford stood up slightly in his chair, his body language becoming more aggressive. Then act like it. Act like a professional instead of someone with an axe to grind who's using their platform to settle personal scores. The other panel members exchanged panicked glances. This had gone far beyond anything they had expected, and it was clear that neither Ford nor Whoopi was backing down. If anything, they seemed to be escalating towards something that would make this interview legendary for all the wrong reasons. What happened next would push this confrontation past the point of no return, as years of Hollywood frustration with media bias and decades of daytime television attitude collided in a spectacular fashion that would leave everyone in the studio stunned and viewers at home reaching for their phones to capture and share what they had just witnessed. Whoopi, her face now flushed with anger and embarrassment at being challenged so directly, made the fatal mistake of escalating further. You know what your problem is, Harrison? You're just another entitled Hollywood actor who can't handle being called out on your privilege. You're having a tantrum because someone finally told you the truth. The words hung in the air like a slap. Ford's expression went completely cold, and for a moment, the entire studio held its breath. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more power than if he had shouted. A tantrum, Ford repeated slowly, his legendary composure now replaced by righteous fury. You think standing up for myself against your unprofessional attack is a tantrum? Let me tell you what a tantrum looks like. A tantrum is inviting someone onto your show under false pretenses and then ambushing them with personal attacks. A tantrum is using your platform to bully a guest instead of having a respectful conversation. He stood up from his chair, his full height and presence commanding the attention of everyone in the studio. I've been doing this for 50 years. I've worked with some of the most difficult people in Hollywood, and I've always maintained my professionalism. But I've never, and I mean never, been treated with such blatant disrespect by someone who claims to be a professional broadcaster. Sonny, Hostin tried one last time to salvage the situation. Harrison, maybe we can just move on and talk about your film. Ford turned to her with an expression that made it clear he was done with all of them. Move on. You think after what just happened? Here, I'm going to sit back down and pretend this is normal? You think I'm going to promote my movie after your colleague just spent the last 10 minutes trying to tear down everything I've worked for? Joy Behar, looking increasingly desperate, attempted humor again. Well, this is certainly more exciting than our usual celebrity interviews. The comment was met with complete silence from Ford, who looked at her with the kind of withering stare that had intimidated directors and studio executives for decades. Exciting? You think publicly humiliating a guest is exciting? You think this kind of behavior is what your audience tunes in to see. Whoopi, realizing she had pushed too far, but unable to back down without losing face, doubled down on her attack. Oh, please. You're acting like we committed some kind of crime. All we did was ask you some tough questions about reality. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. That was the final straw. Ford's eyes flashed with an anger that anyone who had worked with him would recognize as the moment when his legendary patience finally ran out completely. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but carried the full weight of his fury. Can't handle tough questions? Lady, I've handled tough questions from real journalists for 5 decades. What you're doing isn't journalism. It's not even entertainment. It's just mean-spirited bullying disguised as social commentary. And I don't have to sit here and take it. He began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. The audience watched in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's most respected actors prepared to walk away from what had become a complete disaster of an interview. You know what the sad part is? Ford continued, his voice now carrying a tone of genuine disappointment. I actually used to respect this show. I thought it provided an important platform for different perspectives. But what I've experienced here today isn't about perspectives or meaningful dialogue. It's about tearing people down to make yourselves feel important. Sarah Haynes made one desperate attempt to save the situation. Harrison, please, let's just take a breath, and Ford looked at her with something approaching pity. Take a breath? I've been taking breaths for the last 15 minutes while your colleague attacked my character, my career, and my integrity. I'm done taking breaths. I'm done being polite. And I'm definitely done with this conversation. He tossed his microphone onto the coffee table with a gesture that was both final and dismissive. The sound echoed through the now silent studio like a gunshot. Whoopi, perhaps finally realizing the magnitude of what had just happened, tried one last time to regain control. Harrison, you don't have to leave. We can discuss this like adults. Ford turned back to face her one final time. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every iconic character he had ever played, every moment of strength he had brought to the screen over 5 decades of legendary performances. Adults? You want to talk about acting like adults? Adults don't ambush their guests. Adults don't use their platform to settle personal vendettas. Adults show respect for people they invite into their space. What happened here today wasn't adult behavior. It was playground bullying with cameras rolling. He began walking toward the exit, his stride confident and purposeful. The audience sat in complete silence, many of them clearly uncomfortable with what they had witnessed. Some were pulling out their phones, already recording what would become one of the most viral moments in daytime television history. This interview is over, Ford announced as he reached the edge of the set. And frankly, based on what I've experienced here today, I'm not sure why anyone would want to be a guest on this show. You've turned what should have been a pleasant conversation into a public execution. Whoopi, her face now red with embarrassment and anger, made one final, desperate attempt to have the last word. Well, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Ford stopped in his tracks and turned back one last time. The look he gave her was one that would be replayed and analyzed on social media for weeks to come. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the studio. You know what? That comment right there tells everyone watching exactly who you are and what this show has become. Congratulations, Whoopi. You just showed the world that you're more interested in getting the last insult and then maintaining even a shred of professionalism. And with that, Harrison Ford walked off the View set, leaving behind a panel of stunned hosts, a shocked studio audience, and what would become one of the most talked about moments in daytime television history. The silence that followed his exit was deafening, broken only by the uncomfortable shuffling of feet and the quiet murmur of audience members trying to process what they had just witnessed as the cameras continued rolling on the aftermath of the confrontation. It was clear that something significant had just happened. A Hollywood legend had drawn a line in the sand, refusing to be bullied or diminished by hosts who had clearly overplayed their hand. The interview that was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance had instead become a masterclass in how not to treat a guest. and the consequences would reverberate far beyond the studio walls.